Remember when President Trump's tariffs were supposed to crush consumers and trigger a recession? Well, the same experts who predicted doom and gloom are now admitting GDP is up, inflation is down, and stocks have rebounded to hit record highs. Welcome to the Big Money Show. I'm Brian Brenberg, along with my co-hosts Kevin O'Leary, Lydia Hu, Jackie DeAngelis, and with us for the hour, E.J. Antoni, Unleash Prosperity Senior Fellow and Heritage Foundation Economist. Welcome, sir. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
All right. The average U.S. tariff is now close to 1930s levels, and yet no economic collapse, no crisis. Even the biggest skeptics have to admit their panic just didn't pan out.
Tariffs. Now, I remember along with probably most people, was saying at the beginning, oh, you know, by the 4th of July, somebody had to think how the country was, the economy was going to be tanked by then. And I was kind of like, well, that seems right to me, but that didn't happen. The stock market is at record highs. I don't see a country in a depression at all. I see people out there just living their lives.
As the economy defies dire predictions, it's challenging economic orthodoxy. As one columnist puts it in the Wall Street Journal, having broken most of the rules of politics, has Mr. Trump really smashed one of the supposedly iron laws of economics, too? That is a good question. Kevin O'Leary, let me come to you on that one. The economists seem to have been getting it wrong lately. Have they? And what's going on here?
Well, let's talk about the market first, because you're right, it's at all-time highs here. The market is measuring future results in earnings, and right now what the market's sniffing out is access to new markets at a reciprocal tariff price somewhere around 15%. That's the assumption. Now, let's take Europe. This is big news. That's a massive market to gain access to. Why would the Europeans, remember, they negotiate on behalf of 26 entities through one agency, which is like herding cats. So already this morning, the German and the French are a little, well, for lack of a better word, pissed off because they don't like the deal. And they think the tariffs are not symmetric. They're asymmetrical. In other words, the U.S. is doing better than they are. It costs more for them to come here than for us to go there. Why would they agree to this? Simple reason. Pharmaceuticals and automotive. They want to protect those mega industries. And they're getting some protection because everybody thought these tariffs would be just reciprocal across the board. It turns out there's fine-tuning going on here. And if you're a European pharmaceutical company, the last market you can afford to lose access to is the United States of America. So they're taking a lot of pain to keep those two big sectors open. Story's still unfolding, but there is a deal in play here, and the market likes it a lot. Yet to be determined exactly how it plays out. Don't forget, all of these countries are one basket, and the other, the big mama, is China.
Right.
That's a different deal, and that's all over the map right now. That is all over the map. I've got to stay tuned for that one.
And in Sweden, talking about that map and what's all over it as we speak. EJ, GDP was supposed to collapse under these Trump tariffs, and it's not. In fact, maybe it's actually being revised northward, I hear.
Right, and what we've seen just in the last couple of days from the Atlanta Fed, from the St. Louis Fed, from the New York Fed, all of their estimates have gone up in terms of GDP, and we're continuing to see some of those missing imports, as we called them, from the first quarter find their place in the second quarter data. In other words, we got all of the numbers as stuff got imported into the country in Q1. A lot of that was just front running of tariffs, but it didn't all immediately show up in either business inventories or in consumer spending. As that shows up in the second and subsequent quarters, what subtracted out of GDP is now added back to GDP. So you're seeing pretty good growth numbers here, especially if you just look at domestic purchases. So again, as you were saying earlier, Brian, the experts were wrong.
Yeah, a lot of those experts are your friends. Why were they so wrong? Why did like the guys who study for years and years and get paid to be right on this, why have they been so off on this? What do you think?
I think part of it, Brian, has to do with the fact that economics can be a very abstracted science, right? And if you're not constantly, not just into the data on an academic level, but into it on a real world level, it's very easy to stay up in the ivory tower and to forget that the impacts of these things, these different public policies, are not always what you read in the textbook.
So if we come out of the ivory tower, Jackie, consumer confidence rebounding in July on some of the very data that we're talking about here. I know one of your favorite phrases is, "I'm not tired of winning." It seems like a lot of people on the ground are enjoying the winning, and they're responding by powering this economy.
Absolutely. And I don't want to front run you because I know you were very interested in this piece in the Wall Street Journal today by Jerry Baker. It's entitled, "If Tariffs Are So Bad, Where's the Recession?"
Right.
Mr. Baker writes in his piece, economists surveyed by the Journal this month estimate the economy grew by 2% in the second quarter, accelerating out of the first 3 months of the year. They think the odds of a recession in the next year are just 1 in 3. Core inflation remains below 3%, down from 3.5% at the end of last year. Equity markets are reaching new highs as investors have recovered from their panic attack of April. He goes on to explain his thesis, and he says there could be 3 things happening here.
Right.
Number 1, it's too soon to tell. Number 2, the tariffs were not big enough. Remember, they've come down from those Liberation Day levels that we were originally looking at. And then the third, and I'm paraphrasing here, is basically it all evens out in the wash. The exporter eats some, the importer eats some, the consumer might pay a little, but it's negligible and they're not feeling it. And this economy is flexible enough to be able to sustain it. What's interesting to me, though, is what the Democrats are talking about right now.
Okay.
We talked about the tariff rebate check yesterday, or the possibility for that from President Trump, just kind of floating the idea. So the Democrats are essentially saying what's happening here is Americans are struggling. They're feeling the tariffs in prices, and you need this rebate check to be able to throw them a little bone. That is not what's happening here. What's happening here is Americans are still struggling. I'm not going to deny that, but there are things that are positive as we look forward in the horizon that give people a little sense of hope. We are suffering because of the sticky inflation from Joe Biden and his administration. And I'm sorry to look backwards, but I can't help it. The 4 years before President Trump was the worst economic period that I've had to sustain throughout my lifetime, which is limited to compared to some others who are reporting on the topic. I also want to point out a tweet that I saw in my feed from one of my former colleagues who I generally don't agree with, Andrew Ross Sorkin. He wrote this yesterday or a day ago. On June 12, 1934, FDR signed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, a radical change in how America did business with the world. It delegated trade authority from Congress to the president, enabling faster bilateral deals. It was a pivot from the wreckage of Smoot-Hawley. Within 5 years, the U.S. struck over 20 agreements, reshaping U.S. economic diplomacy. I actually agree with him. I couldn't have said it better. I rest my case.
Lydia.
I echo a lot of Jackie, a lot of the points that you just made, a lot of reason to say and recognize that the naysayers in the beginning seems like they're wrong so far. But I wouldn't go so far as to say, and feel free to disagree with me, that we're out of the woods just yet.
Okay.
I think there are a couple of things to continue to track. One of them is the fact that there have been no meaningful price increases. Not to say the tariffs are inflationary, but one would expect if companies are paying more for imported products or parts or what have you, you would see that show up somewhere sometime. So far it hasn't, but there was one example that jumped out. General Motors last week in their earnings said that tariffs on cars and parts led to a $1.1 billion loss in quarterly earnings. They've not said they're going to increase prices, but one has to ask, how long is that sustainable? Makes me just wonder if and when we could see an increase in the prices, even if it's just a one-time adjustment. The other thing, too, that I'm thinking about are the small businesses that maybe are not reflected in the markets, which are doing so well. The small businesses, the Main Street. And I think about them because they're the ones that are continuing this battle against the Trump administration in the courts on the tariff front. And they tell me they're still hurting. They are the ones that are having to, maybe in some small measure, lay off employees. They're having to hold back on their orders. So, I don't think that it's totally done and resolved. And I agree in the big picture, in the larger sense, we're trying to right size and correct a lot of missteps that have been made over the course of decades, encourage reinvestment back into the United States. But it doesn't mean that there's not going to be some pain and sacrifice.
It's a good question. Kevin, are we in the woods? How far are we in the woods? I think your point about China and, that's kind of all over the map. For a small business, those are probably the woods. How is that going to resolve? Where do small businesses stand on this?
I like Lydia's GM point. So let's dig deeper into what the CFO said there. It's a 45% reduction in margin. Yet, when he painted out the rest of this year, the next 6 months, he said, we're going to fix it. Here's how he's suggesting. And he may be the roadmap for every business. 1/3 they're going to eat themselves inside. So they're going to have to find ways to be more productive to absorb that hit. 1/3 they're going to push out in price increases, which I agree is inflationary. But here's the big question that's so fascinating. 1/3 they think they can get back using AI to make their company significantly better at what it does. And I think one of the reasons the market's so optimistic, and certainly when I look at my own small businesses, of which I have 54 in our portfolio that are private companies, every single one of them is figuring out some use of a vertical use of AI to reduce their costs, whether it's an insurance business or whether they're doing wireless charging. How much is that worth? And maybe that's why the market's saying, wait a second, we've never had tariffs before with an AI multiplier in it, because this forces us to figure out a way to be more productive.
Right.
So really what the GM guy is saying is, we're going to increase our productivity almost 50% between what we do internally and what we may be able to do in our supply chain with AI. That, if that ends up being true, Katie, bar the doors on the S&P, because not only you have the revenues from tariffs, which could be reciprocal around 15% by the time it's all over, but you've got massive productivity.
The productivity boom swamps basically whatever the drag would be from the
Feels
tariff
like it.
by a multiple, maybe.
Feels like it.
That's possible.